Ethan Caldwell had built his life on order, control, and precision. There was no room for surprises in his world until one day, a single glance out his window shattered everything he thought he knew. His son Oliver was dancing with her. Elena, the cook he had barely noticed, moved with a grace that didn't belong in a kitchen. It was more than just play, it was art. And in that moment, Ethan realized there was a secret buried in his own home, one he had to uncover. Ethan Caldwell moved through the grand halls of his mansion with the same precision that governed every aspect of his life. Every detail, every decision, every minute of his day was accounted for. His business empire thrived because he left nothing to chance. His home was no different. Everything ran like clockwork. Surprises were unwelcome in Ethan's world. That's why, on a seemingly ordinary afternoon, as he passed by the wide glass windows overlooking his perfectly manicured garden, he stopped in his tracks. His 12-year-old son, Oliver, was dancing. At first, Ethan thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. He blinked, expecting the illusion to fade. But it didn't. Oliver was there, moving, awkwardly, hesitantly, yet with a kind of focus Ethan hadn't seen in years. But it wasn't just Oliver that caught his attention. He wasn't alone. Beside him, guiding his steps with effortless grace, was Elena, the young woman he had barely noticed in the 6 months since she'd been hired as the family's cook. Ethan narrowed his eyes, his sharp mind immediately trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Elena wasn't just entertaining Oliver. She wasn't simply humoring a child's whim. No, she was teaching him, really teaching him. Every movement was deliberate, every correction precise. And Oliver? He was smiling. That single realization hit Ethan harder than he expected. He couldn't remember the last time he had seen his son smile like that. Not since Emily, Oliver's mother, had passed away. Ever since then, Oliver had retreated into himself, locking his emotions away behind books and routines. Ethan had believed he was giving his son everything he needed: structure, stability, security. Yet here he was, laughing, moving freely, because of her. A strange unease settled in Ethan's chest. He wasn't a man easily unsettled, but something about this moment, it felt like he was losing control. He didn't like it. With a firm posture, he stepped outside, his footsteps deliberate, echoing against the stone path. As he approached, both Oliver and Elena noticed him. The boy immediately froze, his laughter vanishing as quickly as if it had never existed. Elena, however, remained composed. She simply straightened, brushing off her apron, and met Ethan's gaze with an unreadable expression. "What is going on here?" Ethan's voice was calm, controlled, but carried the weight of expectation. Oliver lowered his head, hesitating, but Elena answered for him. "We were practicing, Mr. Caldwell," she said simply. "Practicing what exactly?" "Your son wanted to learn how to dance." Ethan turned his sharp gaze to Oliver. "Since when?" Oliver shuffled his feet, his voice barely above a whisper. "For a while now." A flicker of guilt passed through Ethan, quick, sharp, and unexpected. How had he not noticed? Why hadn't Oliver told him? "And why didn't you say anything?" The boy hesitated again, then lifted his shoulders in a small shrug. Before he could answer, Elena spoke. "Because he had no one to practice with." Ethan's gaze snapped back to her. There was something in her voice, steady, firm, unwavering. It irritated him. "This isn't your job," he said coolly. "No, it isn't." "Then why are you doing it?" Elena crossed her arms, her expression calm but unyielding. "Because he asked me to." Ethan turned back to Oliver. "Is that true?" The boy nodded. Silence stretched between them. A silence filled with things Ethan wasn't ready to acknowledge. His irritation deepened, not at them, but at the situation. There was something more to this, something he wasn't seeing, and that was unacceptable. His gaze shifted back to Elena. "I need to speak with you, alone." Oliver's expression flickered with concern, but Elena simply nodded. "As you wish, Mr. Caldwell." Ethan turned sharply and headed back toward the house, not bothering to check if she was following. But as he stepped inside, something made him glance back. Oliver had leaned toward Elena, whispering something. She answered in a quiet tone, her face unreadable. And then, to Ethan's surprise, Oliver smiled. A small, conspiratorial smile. A chill ran down Ethan's spine. There was more to this than he understood, and he was determined to uncover the truth. Ethan Caldwell sat in his office, fingers steepled beneath his chin, his sharp gaze locked onto the computer screen before him. The file on the monitor was sparse, frustratingly so. "Elena Ruiz," age 29, hired as a cook 6 months ago. No criminal record, no red flags, nothing unusual. On paper, she was exactly what she claimed to be, an ordinary employee working in his household. And yet, Ethan's instincts screamed that she was something more. His instincts had never failed him before. In business, they had built his empire. They had warned him of unseen threats, of deals that seemed perfect on the surface but were rotten at the core. And now, those same instincts told him that Elena Ruiz was not just a cook, not after what he had seen in the garden, not after the way she moved, her precision, her posture, her control. It wasn't the casual enthusiasm of someone who danced as a hobby. It was training, discipline, experience. A thought nagged at the back of his mind, an idea that had been forming ever since he saw her dance. Slowly, deliberately, Ethan typed her name into a broader search, adding one simple keyword: Elena Ruiz ballerina. At first, nothing. A few irrelevant results. A social media account with no useful information. Then, something buried beneath old news articles. Ethan leaned forward, his pulse quickening as he clicked the link. A headline appeared: Young ballet prodigy disappears from the stage without explanation. His breath stilled. Below the headline was a photograph. A much younger Elena stood in a pristine white ballet costume, her arms lifted in perfect form, her expression serene and confident. Nothing like the reserved woman who worked in his kitchen. Ethan's eyes skimmed through the article. She had been a rising star, performing in some of the most prestigious theaters, gaining recognition as a talent beyond her years. Critics had called her a once-in-a-generation dancer, destined for an international career. And then, she vanished. No scandal, no public incident, no farewell interviews. Just gone. Ethan sat back in his chair, exhaling sharply. Why would someone with that kind of talent abandon everything? And how did she end up here, cooking in his house? The questions piled up in his mind, refusing to be ignored. He knew he wouldn't get the answers just by staring at a screen. He needed to hear them from her. Ethan strode into the kitchen with purpose. As expected, Elena was there, methodically cleaning the countertops, her movements as precise as ever. She sensed him before he spoke, glancing up, her expression neutral but guarded. "Mr. Caldwell," she greeted, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Is there something you need?" Ethan didn't answer. Instead, he pulled out his phone, turned the screen toward her and placed it on the counter. The article, her past, was displayed in plain sight. Care to explain this? For the first time since he had met her, Ethan saw something flicker across her face. Genuine surprise. It was brief, controlled, but it was there. Elena looked at the screen, then back at him. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm. Too calm. "You've been searching for me." Ethan folded his arms. "I don't like mysteries in my home." She exhaled slowly and placed the dish towel down. For a moment he thought she might refuse to answer. Then, after a long pause, she spoke. "I suppose I should have expected this," she said quietly. "You're not the type of man to leave things unanswered." Ethan remained silent. He only waited. Elena looked down at the article again, her fingers grazing the edge of the counter. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer, quieter, different from the composed woman he had come to know. "I was a dancer," she admitted, "a long time ago." Ethan narrowed his eyes. "You were more than just a dancer. You were a star." A bitter smile touched her lips. A star that burned out before it could shine. Ethan studied her carefully. "Why did you leave?" She hesitated. He could see the conflict in her eyes, the way she weighed whether to tell him the truth. Finally, she sighed. "Because I lost everything." Her voice was almost a whisper now, more vulnerable than he had ever heard it before. Ethan didn't push. He just waited. "When I was 22, dance was my entire world," she said. "It was all I knew, all I cared about. I trained endlessly, pushing myself beyond limits, because I believed I was meant for something greater." She paused, then added, "And I wasn't alone." Ethan frowned. "Who?" Elena hesitated before answering. "My fiancé, Adrian." Her voice barely held together as she said his name. "He was a dancer too. We had trained together since we were kids. We were supposed to take on the world together." Ethan already knew where this was going. "We were offered an international tour," she continued, her gaze unfocused, lost in the memory. "A dream we had worked for our entire lives." She swallowed hard. "The day before our biggest performance, Adrian was hit by a car." Silence. Ethan didn't speak. He let the weight of her words settle between them. He died instantly, she whispered. And after that, I couldn't dance. I couldn't even hear music without feeling like a part of me had been ripped away. Everything I had built my life around was gone. She let out a slow breath, so I disappeared. Ethan exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. He had expected something tragic, but not this. Not a grief so raw it had driven her to abandon her entire identity. So you became a cook? He asked, not unkindly. Elena let out a quiet, humorless laugh. I needed something far removed from dance, something practical, something safe. Ethan held her gaze for a long moment. And yet, he said slowly, you're teaching my son. Her eyes flickered with something unreadable. Yes? Why? She hesitated, then finally answered, because he reminds me of myself at his age. Ethan stiffened. How? Elena's expression softened. Because he doesn't smile, Mr. Caldwell. The words struck him harder than he expected. His jaw clenched, but he couldn't argue, because she was right. Ethan Caldwell sat at the head of the long dining table, his sharp gaze fixed on his son. Across from him, Oliver stood stiffly, his small hands clenched into fists. The weight of the moment pressed between them, thick and unspoken. Finally, Oliver took a deep breath, his voice steady but filled with nerves. I want to compete in a dance tournament. The room fell into silence. The chandeliers above cast a warm glow over the polished wood, but the air felt heavy with expectation. Ethan placed his silverware down with deliberate slowness, his expression unreadable. A dance tournament, he repeated, as if testing the words. Oliver nodded firmly. Yes, I want to compete. Ethan exhaled, leaning back in his chair. He studied his son, truly looking at him for the first time in a long while. There was something in Oliver's eyes, something new. Determination. A fire that hadn't been there before. And when did you decide this? Oliver hesitated for only a moment. A while ago. I've been training with Elena, and she thinks I'm ready. Ethan's expression didn't change, but at the mention of Elena, something flickered in his gaze. Does she? Oliver stood taller. Yes, and I believe I am too. Ethan remained silent, his thoughts carefully measured. He had always believed in discipline, in control. Dance was neither. Dance was chaos, unpredictable, driven by emotion, not logic. You realize this isn't a game, he said finally. Competitions aren't about fun. They're about discipline, pressure, expectation. Oliver didn't flinch. I know, and I'm ready for that. Ethan stared at him for a long moment. Then at last he exhaled. Fine. Oliver's eyes widened in surprise. Ethan folded his arms. But if you're going to do this, you do it properly. No half measures. You commit to it fully. A grin broke across Oliver's face, so wide and genuine that it stunned Ethan for a moment. Thank you, Dad. Later that evening, Ethan found Elena in the kitchen, carefully chopping vegetables. She looked up as he entered, already sensing why he was there. You knew he would ask me, Ethan said, folding his arms. Elena wiped her hands on a towel before turning to face him. I suspected. Ethan studied her. You think he's ready? She tilted her head slightly. He has the passion, the drive, the discipline will come with time. Ethan exhaled, fingers tapping against the counter. If he does this, he will experience failure, rejection. He may not be able to handle that. Elena studied him for a moment before speaking. Or maybe you're the one who isn't ready to handle it. Ethan's jaw tightened. He didn't argue. He only said, if we do this, we do it right. That means you train him properly. No soft encouragements. He needs to be pushed. Elena's lips curled slightly. I wasn't planning on going easy on him. The mornings at the Caldwell estate changed overnight. Where there had once been quiet, controlled routines, there was now the steady rhythm of music playing from the grand ballroom. The space, once used for formal gatherings, had been transformed into a training ground. And at the center of it all was Oliver. Ethan stood at the doorway, watching as his son pushed himself through another grueling practice session. His hair clung to his forehead, his breathing heavy as he moved through the steps. Elena called out. Again, she instructed, her voice firm but not unkind. Oliver wiped sweat from his brow and reset his stance. His muscles trembled with exhaustion, but there was no hesitation in his movements. He had changed in these past weeks, his posture stronger, his steps sharper. The hesitant boy who once second-guessed himself was gone. In his place stood someone with purpose. Ethan remained silent as he observed. It was unfamiliar territory for him, watching rather than controlling. He had built his entire life on calculated decisions, ensuring everything around him operated with precision. And yet, here, in this space, there was no logic, no equations, only movement, only feeling. And his son, he had never seen Oliver so alive. One evening, after a particularly grueling session, Oliver sat at the dining table, barely touching his food. His leg bounced beneath the table, nerves practically radiating off him. Ethan noticed. "What's on your mind?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. Oliver hesitated before speaking. "There's another dancer in the tournament," he admitted. "His name is Santiago Beltran. He's won the last 2 years." Ethan nodded slowly, already recognizing the concern in his son's voice. Oliver bit his lip before continuing. "He messaged me," he said, his voice quieter now. "Told me I don't stand a chance." Ethan's fingers tightened around his glass. A sharp, familiar protectiveness stirred within him, the same instinct that had made him ruthless in business. He had built an empire from the ground up, learning that the world did not reward weakness. But as he looked at his son, he didn't see a boy ready to crumble. He saw someone searching for reassurance. Ethan leaned forward slightly. "Listen to me, Oliver," he said, his voice steady. "People only try to break you down when they see you as a threat." Oliver blinked, his expression shifting slightly. Ethan continued. "If Santiago is going out of his way to talk to you, it means he's already worried." Oliver's posture changed. The self-doubt in his eyes wavered, replaced by something else. "You really think so?" he asked. Ethan nodded. "I know so." Oliver exhaled, and for the first time since the conversation started, he smiled. It was small, but it was real. "Then I guess I'll just have to prove him wrong." The tournament approached faster than any of them anticipated. Training intensified. Oliver pushed himself harder than ever, working late into the evenings, repeating routines over and over. What had once been playful excitement had now become something else. Determination. Ethan found himself drawn to every session, no longer just as an observer, but as something more. He had never been one to waste time on sentimentality, but as he watched his son work, fail, and get back up again, he felt something unfamiliar stir within him. It wasn't just pride. It was admiration. And for the first time, he wasn't just watching to assess. He was watching to understand. The theater buzzed with energy. Backstage, dancers stretched, rehearsed footwork, and whispered last-minute words of encouragement to one another. The air was thick with nervous anticipation, the scent of hairspray and stage lights filling the space. Oliver stood among them, adjusting the straps of his dance shoes. His hands trembled slightly, but his posture remained strong. This was it. The moment he had worked for. A few feet away, Ethan watched, his arms crossed as he observed his son. He had always been the kind of man who thrived on control, who shaped outcomes through force of will. But here, in this moment, there was nothing he could do. Oliver was stepping onto that stage alone, and Ethan had no power over what happened next. Beside Oliver, Elena placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "Breathe," she said simply. Oliver exhaled slowly, nodding. "You've done the work," she continued. "The only thing left to do is dance." Ethan saw it then, the ease between them, the unspoken understanding. It stirred something unfamiliar in him, something that made him feel like an outsider looking in. Elena had given Oliver something that he hadn't been able to. Confidence. Not the kind built from expectation, but from passion. He clenched his jaw, forcing the thought aside. Now wasn't the time for reflection. The announcer's voice echoed through the speakers. "Next, we welcome Oliver Caldwell to the stage." Oliver swallowed hard. His gaze flickered to Ethan, searching for something. Reassurance, approval, maybe even permission. Ethan gave a single nod. "Go," he said firmly. Oliver stepped onto the stage, the bright lights blinding for a moment. The silence from the audience pressed against him like a weight. Then the music began, and Oliver let go. His body moved before his mind could second-guess it. The first step was precise, the second even smoother. He let the rhythm take over, every movement flowing into the next. The stage became his world, and suddenly the pressure melted away. This wasn't about Santiago. It wasn't about winning. It was about this, the dance, the feeling. The final sequence approached, the most difficult move in his routine. A spin and leap he had struggled with for weeks. He braced himself, pushed off the floor. For a brief moment, time seemed to slow. Then he landed, light on his feet, steady. The music stopped. For a second, Silence. Then applause. The sound erupted through the theater, waves of cheers crashing against him. Oliver stood there, chest rising and falling, sweat dampening his skin. He scanned the crowd. His father was on his feet, clapping. Elena too, her eyes shining with pride. The results were announced soon after, and the winner of this year's competition is Santiago Beltran. The crowd cheered as Santiago stepped forward, his confident smirk unwavering. Oliver swallowed hard, forcing himself to keep his expression neutral. He had lost. But before he could fully process the disappointment, the announcer spoke again. We would also like to present a special award for artistic expression, one that recognizes not just technical skill, but passion, connection, and heart. This award goes to Oliver Caldwell. The applause rose again. Oliver blinked in surprise as his name echoed through the theater. He stepped forward, feeling the cool weight of the medal as it was placed around his neck. It wasn't first place, but as he turned toward the audience, his father's expression told him everything he needed to know. Later, as Oliver removed his dance shoes in the dressing room, Santiago approached. He twirled his trophy in his hands, his smirk slightly less cocky. "Not bad," he said. "You might actually be decent next year." Oliver smiled slightly. "Next year I'm winning." Santiago smirked. "We'll see about that." Outside the theater, Ethan and Elena waited. When Oliver finally emerged, Ethan placed a hand on his shoulder. "How do you feel?" he asked. Oliver thought for a moment before answering. "Proud." Ethan nodded. "Good." As they walked toward the car, Oliver glanced down at the medal in his hands. This wasn't about winning or losing. It was about proving to himself that he belonged on that stage, that he was capable, and next time, he would be even better. Ethan watched his son, seeing something new in him, something stronger, and for the first time in a long time he felt it too. Not just pride, but something deeper. He had spent years chasing control, perfection, results, and yet, in this moment, he finally understood. It had never been about the outcome. It had always been about the journey.